Welcome to Last Stand Stories. The year is 1868. 19 men wait in the cold snow. Help never comes. This is their final fight.
They had lain on the snow for 23 days. At the end of December 1868, when the scouting party, returning to the Washita Valley by the order of General Philip Sheridan, descended to the frozen banks of the river, the first thing they saw was not snow. The snow had already covered them. The first thing they saw was a piece of a frozen hand protruding from beneath the snow. Sergeant John Ryan identified that hand. He described it. Then he fell silent. The party slowed down as they advanced through the snow. No one did this by command. Legs grew heavy on their own, because as the snow thinned, the shapes beneath it became clearer, and those shapes had long surpassed the familiar boundaries of human anatomy. 19 bodies lay compressed into an area of about 30 meters. This compression was no coincidence. It was a geometry. As the men drew inward from the death surrounding them, they had formed this shape, the end point of a circle. The closer one approached the center, the longer death was delayed, but in the end, all had arrived at the same place. There were no uniforms. There were no boots. There were no traces of class rings, pocket watches, dog tags, buttons, or buckles. The bodies were completely stripped of identity. This was an act of rage, but also of practicality. For the Cheyenne warriors, uniforms were valuable. Metal pieces were valuable. Leather boots were valuable. The bodies were left behind only after every usable item had been taken. What remained was a completely naked and frozen mass of flesh, possessing neither name, nor rank, nor unit. Dr. Henry Lippincott, the medical officer in the field, directed the examination. His records were brief and clinical, for there was no warmth in the field to keep long records, and moreover some things grew heavier as they were documented. According to Lippincott's records, the vast majority of the bodies had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. The ballistic distribution of the wounds revealed that the deaths were not the result of a single, momentary clash. The men had been killed at different times from different distances. This was the anatomy of a prolonged process. The skull damage was systematic. Lippincott did not shy away from noting this. Head trauma was detected in 14 bodies. The form of trauma was caused by blunt force, not by edged weapons. There were blood stains on large rocks found in the field. This was a post-battle act. Systematic blows brought down upon the bodies with rocks after the moment of death. This held a cultural meaning. In Cheyenne tradition, crushing an enemy warrior's skull was believed to prevent his soul's passage to the next world. This was rage, yes, but it was also a message. These men had no place either in this world or the next. The first body to be identified belonged to Major Joel Elliott. What distinguished Elliott from the rest was a facial wound, 2 bullet entrances, 1 exit. Lippincott recorded this. Elliott's body was a few meters away from the others. This distance would be debated in the following weeks. Some suggested Elliott had tried to flee. Others argued he had stepped forward to protect the last of his men. The body offered no answer to this debate. Bodies never answer. They only leave questions. One of the unit's officers, a lieutenant who was close to Captain Lewis Hamilton, stopped speaking during the examination. Hamilton had died in Custer's main assault, a proper uniform death in the first minutes of the battle. These men, beneath the snow, however, were found frozen and naked weeks later. The lieutenant did not express this difference in words. He did not need to. Everyone in the detachment already knew what this difference meant. During the expedition, the ambient temperature was around minus 17 degrees Celsius. 23 days earlier, on the day the battle took place, the weather had been just as cold. The frozen ground had not swallowed the blood. The snow had covered the blood. When the officers examined the snow's surface, they found dark brown stains beneath it. Blood turns brown when it freezes. This color remained from the final minutes of that morning. The heaviest line of Lippincott's report was perhaps the shortest. The survival time of the wounded varied. This sentence meant that some men died quickly, and some did not. It was not known how long the 19 men survived after being surrounded. It was impossible to know. But ballistic evidence and ammunition remnants presented a specific picture. The men used their bullets until the very end. The distribution of empty casings on the field confirmed this. There were fewer empty casings next to the bodies in the center, because those in the center died later, because those on the outside spent their bullets trying to protect them. This described a tactic, not an irregular defense, but a conscious one. The men were in order even as they died. Who had established this order? Elliot, or had it formed spontaneously? The body did not tell this either. The scouting party gathered the bodies. There were no wooden coffins. Blankets were used. Every body was carefully wrapped, but identification was still uncertain. The officers tried to discern who they could recognize by looking at the faces. The frozen faces made recognition difficult. The cold freezes expression. It forces the face into an unfamiliar geometry. Some men had changed drastically over the weeks. In the end, 16 bodies were positively identified. 3 remained unidentified. Those 3 men remained in military records as unidentified soldier for a long time. It was unknown whether they had families. It was later discovered that one of them had corresponded with a farming family from Kansas, but that letter was in that man's frozen pocket beneath the snow, and it could not be found until the snow melted. What was found was not a battle. The battle had ended weeks ago. What was found was the remnant of a betrayal. When the bugle calls faded into the distance, Joel Elliott had not yet fully grasped what this meant. It all began before sunrise on the morning of November 27th, 1868. The Cheyenne village stretching along the Washita River slept in the dark. General Custer had planned a simultaneous attack from 4 flanks. Major Elliott was to advance from the northeast flank. The plan was simple. The execution deviated from the plan within the first 10 minutes. When the interior of the village turned into chaos, a group of Cheyenne warriors and civilians began to flee downstream. This flight caught Elliott's attention. There were armed warriors among those fleeing. Elliott assessed this as an officer. A fleeing enemy is pursued. This was the foundation of cavalry doctrine. "We can catch them," he said. He called out to the men beside him. 18 privates, including the bugler, rode downstream in pursuit of Elliott. Elliott's final sentence was relayed by the survivors: another victory or death. This sentence would be remembered in the following years with both praise and sorrow. The sentence itself was a cliché, the kind of sentence cavalry officers kept constantly on their tongues. But that morning it turned into reality. Down the river was a different world. As Elliott and his men descended into the valley, the topography changed. The open plain north of the river turned into a narrow valley mouth in the south. The tracks on the snow multiplied. While chasing the fleeing group, Elliott noticed that the tracks no longer stretched in a single direction, but in multiple directions. This was a crucial detail, but it was too late to realize it. In Cheyenne tradition, winter villages were not established alone. Along the Washita, there were multiple villages, a few kilometers apart from each other. The village under attack was only one link in this chain. Warriors emerging from the lower villages mobilized when they began to hear the gunshots. Elliott and his men had entered the valley mouth before noticing the movement of these warriors. The circle closed very quickly. Private Benjamin McDermott was one of the few who witnessed that moment. He was wounded that day, but survived because he had separated from Elliott a short while prior. In his testimony years later, McDermott said, "I saw that movement closing in on Major Elliott's men. It was as if the earth was swallowing them." McDermott could do nothing to stop this. At that moment he was trying to save his own life. When Elliott saw the first wave of warriors surround him in the valley, a corner of his mind still calculated that Custer would send a rescue unit. This was logical. Heavy gunfire was being heard. Heavy gunfire, within military logic, required troop support. Elliot relied on this logic, but that logic didn't apply to the man 2 miles away. Elliot's men repelled the first wave. They took casualties, but they held on. On the open plain, there was no cover, but the places they fell in the snow created small natural depressions. The men spread out into these depressions, a depth of a few centimeters in the snow, where the cover was called a hollow. But in the midst of nothingness, even this much was valuable. The gunfire continued. In the main camp, 2 miles to the north, these sounds were heard. There is no debate on this point. The testimonies of the surviving officers are consistent. The sounds were heard. Custer heard them too. The officers at his headquarters heard them too. The sounds were not distant and ambiguous. Intermittent, intense, desperate gunfire. An experienced officer would understand without hesitation what this sound meant. Elliot and his men waited. Within the first half hour, the expectation was still logical. Rescue units would take time. Custer needed to secure the village first. Elliot made this calculation. He called out to his men. He adjusted the positions. He counted the bullets. How much ammunition had each private attached to his belt? This number was important. This number determined how long they could hold out. An hour passed. Then came the sound of the bugle. This was not the sound Elliot was expecting. It was not the approach bugle announcing a rescue unit. This sound was the rally command. In American cavalry tradition, the meaning of this command was singular and clear. The unit is retreating. Everyone returned to the main force. The sound was coming not from the valley but from beyond the north, and it was gradually fading away. What did Elliot feel when he heard this sound? No one knows. But his men heard it, and the men's faces interpreted this sound. Private James Crawford was next to Elliot at that moment. Crawford did not survive that morning, but another private in Crawford's unit later relayed, "When we heard the bugle call, Crawford's voice cut off. He said nothing. He just looked north." Looking north meant looking in the direction Custer had gone. Meanwhile, the enemy circle was tightening. The second wave arrived. This wave was more coordinated than the first because the warriors had also had time. They had realized that Elliot's men were now alone. The circle narrowed. The fire intensified. Elliot pulled his men to the center. This was a defensive instinct. When the men on the outside drew inward, the area covered by the circle shrank. A shrinking area meant a more defensible position theoretically, but at the same time it also meant that there was no longer an escape route. This movement was recorded as a final maneuver. The bullets were running low. They did not have to count it. The men felt the weapon firing more heavily, the weapon heating up more and more after the trigger was pulled, the sound of the casings in the hands of the man beside them. These sounds form a rhythm, and when that rhythm slows down, everyone knows what it means. The bugle call ceased entirely. There was no longer any sound in the north either. The north was silent. Inside the valley, there was only the wind and the movement of the Cheyenne warriors. Elliot and his men now knew the truth completely. This was no longer a matter of calculation. This was a reality of abandonment. What was to be done with the remaining bullets? The answer to this question was hidden in the ballistic remnants. According to the empty casings found on the field, the men fired until the last bullet. No private saved his ammunition. This meant there was no surrender. And it meant something else. The men did not let go of the belief that they would be rescued until the very end. Until the last bullet was fired, they thought someone would come. Or another possibility. They had no other choice anyway. In that silent geometry of the valley, 19 men spent their final bullets, knowing that the bugle call of the American army was fading away. This is one of the coldest sentences in military history. And that morning, 2 miles to the north, George Armstrong Custer knew this truth. George Armstrong Custer was certain he had won a victory that morning. This certainty was not the product of a military assessment. It was the product of a personal mythology. Custer saw himself as the natural triumph of American cavalry warfare. This belief had been reinforced since West Point. The victories he won in the Civil War, at Gettysburg, at Yellow Tavern, had fed this belief. But every victory also created a blind spot. Custer's blind spot was this: victory superseded everything. At the Washita, victory meant taking the village. The village had been taken. The warriors had been killed. One of their leaders, Black Kettle, had lost his life on the banks of the river. In Custer's mind, the battle was complete. The report could be written. Praise could be expected. In this state of mind, the gunfire coming from the valley was a complication. Complications did not make it into victory reports. When the gunfire was first heard, Custer was at his headquarters. The interior of the village was still being secured. Some structures had been set on fire. The horses were being gathered. The Cheyenne winter provisions were being destroyed. These were tactically necessary operations, and these operations required attention. The gunfire continued. Captain Frederick Benteen was near Custer that morning. Benteen did not like Custer. This dislike was mutual, and both sides knew it. But Benteen was doing his duty as an officer, and part of his duty that morning was to interpret the sound he heard. Benteen wrote this in his diary. Heavy firing was coming from the southeast. I had no doubt as to what this sound meant. Benteen went to Custer. There is heavy fighting to the south, he said. Elliot must be there. Custer did not reply. This was a silence. But this silence did not come from a failure to hear. Custer had no hearing problem that morning. The silence indicated that a calculation was being made. Custer was evaluating what Benteen had said, and the result of the evaluation was to take no action. The anatomy of this decision has been analyzed repeatedly by military historians. The emerging picture shows a combination of multiple factors. The first factor was tactical uncertainty. It was known that there were other villages in the lower valley. If a rescue unit were sent, this unit could also fall into a trap. This was a genuine risk assessment, but this assessment was simultaneously the logical justification for inaction, and Custer clung to this justification. The second factor was the image of victory. Custer's position in Washington was sensitive. He had rivals within the army. General Sheridan trusted him, but this trust would not last forever. If a rescue operation was initiated and this operation failed, the victory report could turn into a defeat report. Taking this risk found no place in Custer's calculation. The third factor was Elliot himself. The relationship between Elliot and Custer was complex. Elliot was a capable officer. Some officers considered Elliot more capable than Custer. This opinion had reached Custer's ears. The hierarchy among officers was never solely a matter of rank. It was a matter of prestige. For Elliot to return as a hero would mean sharing Custer's victory. For Elliot not to return meant remaining a footnote in Custer's report. Attributing this thought process to Custer is a subject of debate among historians. Proving that a commander developed a psychological motivation to consciously abandon his subordinate to death is difficult, but the outcome of the behavior implies the existence of this motivation. Custer remained motionless while his men died 2 miles away, and he could never explain this inaction in a satisfactory manner. Benteen returned to headquarters. The other officers had also noticed the situation. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey had approached the mouth of the valley when he rode south. From a distance he had seen that the clash was continuing. When he turned his horse to go and inform Custer, the bugle had given the rally command. In the memoir he wrote years later, Godfrey asked this question: did the men in the South hear that sound too? This question was not rhetorical. This question was an accusation. When the rally bugle sounded, Custer's order was clear. The unit was retreating. The village had been burned to the ground. The provisions had been destroyed. Captives had been taken. The day was darkening. Custer was writing the victory report in his mind, but Elliot was still in the South. During the retreat, the officers beside Custer were silent. This silence did not stem from approval. There was an unspoken thing within the detachment. The name of the unspoken thing was another name for betrayal: abandonment. In the initial report Custer wrote that night, he did not mention Elliot. This was a conspicuous absence. The report contained the details of the assault, the captured spoils, the number of warriors killed. In the casualties section, Custer listed the dead from his own unit. Elliot and his 18 privates were not on this list. These were not casualties. They had not even been entered into the casualties column. Benteen did not remain silent when he saw this report. Under the protection of anonymity, he wrote a letter. He sent it to newspaper correspondent Daniel Sheridan. In the letter, he openly wrote that Elliot and his men had been abandoned. When the letter was published, a rift formed within the army. Custer confronted the officers to find the author of this letter. When he learned that Benteen had written it, an open argument broke out at headquarters. According to some accounts, Custer drew a riding crop. Benteen, on the other hand, said, "I will use my weapon, if necessary." This scene appears in different forms in the memoirs of both officers, but its essence does not change. Custer tried to violently silence the criticism, and this effort itself implied the validity of the criticism. The official explanation was different. In statements given later, Custer said the following: he did not know where Elliot was. Initiating a search operation was impossible due to enemy pressure. The provisions and captives were in danger. These justifications bore military logic. Examined individually, each of them could be defended. But when examined together, a different picture emerged. Custer heard the gunfire. The officers who knew this were alive and spoke. Custer did not launch a rescue operation. The officers who knew this were alive and wrote. Custer did not mention Elliot's name in his first report. This report was in the archives and could not be altered. When these three facts were placed side by side, the "I did not know" defense did not hold up. Of the 19 men who died in the South that day, only a few entered the official records as combat casualties. The rest remained in the missing status for a long time. Their families waited for letters. Some waited for years. The awaited letters never arrived, because the men who would write those letters had spent their last bullets at the mouth of the valley, hearing the bugle call fade away. There was no cover on the snow. This was the truth that changed everything. On the open plain, on the flat floor of the valley, when the 19 men were surrounded, they looked around, and what they saw was this: nothingness. A flat, white, endless expanse. The reeds on the riverbank, a few bare tree trunks. These were not cover. These were the worst imitations of things that could serve as cover. Elliot rapidly grouped his men. This was a reflex command, a movement ingrained in officer training. If under threat, rally the men. When rallied, the resulting shape naturally became a circle, because the threat was coming from all directions, and the human body instinctively forms a circle against a multi-directional threat. This was a tactical decision, but it was also a final decision, because a circle can be a trap just as much as it is a defensive position. What lay outside the circle was not clear. The Cheyenne warriors were not fighting in the open. Forming a silhouette against a white background on the snow meant death. The warriors used the reeds on the riverbank. They used the curves of the shoreline. They used the slight slope of the valley. They were not invisible, but neither were they visible. The fire was coming from multiple points, from multiple angles. This was a coordinated suppression tactic. Elliot's men returned this fire, but to shoot at a target, one must first see the target. They fired at something moving in the reeds. They fired at a dark shape on the riverbank. Sometimes it was accurate. Mostly it was not. Bullets were dwindling. Every private had started that morning with a standard ammunition load. A cavalry private carried 40.44 caliber cartridges in his belt pouch. Additional cartridges were in the rifle pouch. In total, a private possessed an average of 100 rounds. This was sufficient for a normal engagement. In a normal engagement, ammunition would be resupplied. This was not a normal engagement. Within the first half hour, the men on the outermost edge had spent the majority of their bullets. These men were the ones firing the most, because they were the ones under the most threat. The outer ring of the circle was where the pressure first hit, and this ring melted away. First the wounded fell. Then those who came to the side of the wounded fell. Elliot saw this erosion from inside the circle. Every casualty from the outside shrank the circle. Every shrinking circle brought the remaining men closer together. This proximity was a consolation from a psychological standpoint, but from a military standpoint it was a trap, because a compressed target was an easier target. The chain of command began to become theoretical at this point. Elliot was alive, but two of the sergeants beside him had fallen. Orders were still being given, but the men receiving orders were steadily decreasing, and at a certain point the link between the given order and the man who would execute it broke, because that man had run out of bullets, because that man was wounded, because that man was no longer there. While maintaining its theoretical existence, the chain of command had become dysfunctional in practice. The ballistic examination later revealed the following picture. Based on the empty casings found on the field, the total number of rounds fired by the 19 men exceeded 800. This number meant an average of 42 bullets per person. Considering the initial load, it could be calculated that the men lost their lives having spent more than half of their bullets. But this average was deceptive. The distribution was not equal. There were more empty casings next to the men on the outside, fewer next to the men on the inside. This indicated the following. When the men on the outside died, the bullets remaining in their hands had passed to the men on the inside. This was a spontaneous resupply occurring on the battlefield. With the bullets taken from the dead, the living held on a little longer. This detail describes two things at once. First, the men maintained an organized defense until the last moment. Second, the raw material of this organization was their own dead. The freezing cold was a separate factor. The temperature on the battlefield had risen from -15 to -12 as the sun climbed. This was still a dangerous temperature for human survival. But during an engagement, adrenaline masked the cold for a while. The men did not feel the cold as they ran, fired, and shouted. They began to feel the cold in the moments when movement ceased, and as movement slowed down, the cold seeped in. For the wounded, the cold was a separate mechanism of death. A wounded man lying in the snow rapidly loses blood and body heat. The two factors work together. Blood loss weakens the body, and the cold accelerates this weakness. Some men died of the cold, not from bullets. The ballistic examination attempted to distinguish these men. In some cases it was possible. In some cases it was not. In the final stage of the narrowing circle, the surviving men had dropped below 10. At this point, one more thing changed. Sound. In combat, sound is a source of information. Hearing the man next to them fire communicated that he was alive. The sound of fire from the left communicated that the flank was still held. But as the men continued to fall one by one, the sounds also ceased one by one, and every silent sound deepened the isolation. The silence of the final minutes is told in a language different from ballistic evidence. The final position marks found on the field indicated that approximately 5 or 6 men were together, knee prints and handprints close to each other in the snow. These men were side by side until the very end. Right around their positions were empty casings. These casings represented bullets fired in every direction when looking at the range. The enemy was now at close quarters from all directions. When did the last bullets run out? The field held no answer to this question. But one thing is certain. After they ran out, the clash continued, because some injuries were caused not by firearms, but by close quarters combat. In Lippincott's report, Edged weapon wounds were documented. This indicated that the men used their weapons as assault tools. An empty rifle can be used as a club, but this did not alter the outcome either. The circle closed. With a systematic and cold-blooded closure, the warriors did not retreat. There was nowhere to run, not for them, but for Elliot's men. And this geometry did not change until the last minute. When exactly Elliot died cannot be known. His body was found near the edge of the circle. This implied that he remained outside until the last moment, trying to keep his men inside, or it implied something entirely different. Perhaps in those final minutes Elliot still believed Custer would come, and with this belief he had turned his eyes north, toward the direction the bugle sound had come from. The north was silent. 2 miles away, the man who was the source of that silence was preparing his victory report. Custer completed the report within 3 days. The report complied with military correspondence standards. It was written in proper language. It contained the time of the assault, the force used, the captured spoils, the destroyed provisions, and the number of warriors killed. When presented to General Sheridan, Sheridan expressed his satisfaction. It was forwarded to Washington. It leaked to the press. The newspapers presented the Washita as a victory. Joel Elliott's name was not in the report. This absence was not a mistake. In military reports, missing officers were always mentioned. The wounded were mentioned. The dead were mentioned. Elliott and his 18 privates fit into none of these categories. The report had erased their existence from the start. They were there that morning. Then they were not. And this transition was not marked in any way in the official document. Benteen saw this. Frederick Benteen was forced to maintain his relationship with Custer for 10 years. This relationship never went beyond mutual toleration. When evaluating Custer, Benteen used military language, unreliable command. This was not a personal judgment, it was a professional observation, and the Washita substantiated this observation. The anonymous letter Benteen wrote was published in the Missouri Democrat newspaper. The letter openly stated that Elliott and his men had been abandoned. It was written unsigned, because Benteen knew a signed accusation would destroy him. But the style was recognizable. Upon reading it, Custer understood who the author was. The confrontation at headquarters took place a few days later. Different accounts convey this scene in different ways. But there is a point where all accounts intersect. Custer walked toward Benteen. He had something in his hand. According to some accounts, it was a riding crop. According to others, a stick. Benteen, however, reached for his revolver. "If you touch me, I will kill you," he said. This sentence is recounted with different words in different versions, but the meaning is the same. Custer retreated. This retreat was a physical defeat, but more importantly, it was a symbolic rupture. The officers saw this scene. They saw what was happening within the unit, and from that moment on, Custer's authority rested on a different foundation. Fear-based authority is always fragile. When respect-based authority is lost, only rank remains, and rank is a piece of paper. An official investigation was not opened. General Sheridan had presented the Washita as a victory. An investigation would open this victory to debate. A debate would also call Sheridan's own decisions into question. The winter campaign was Sheridan's strategy, striking the Plains tribes in the winter months when they were most vulnerable. This strategy had worked, ostensibly. An investigation that would question it would serve no political purpose. Elliott and his men were left out of this calculation. The official notices sent to families were brief and vague. The phrase "missing in action" was used. This phrase was technically accurate, but it did not explain what was lost. It didn't explain at all by whose decisions they were lost. The families received the letters. Some requested more information. More information did not arrive. The rift within the cavalry regiment did not close. Among the officers, those who supported Custer and those who did not emerged. This division was not a professional one. It was a moral division. Those who supported Custer believed in his military genius, or pretended to believe. Those who did not support Custer, on the other hand, remembered Elliot's name. Benteen became the silent leader of this group. Silent, because open opposition was a matter of career. But silence did not mean forgetting. Benteen noted this event at every opportunity. In his letters, his diary, his informal conversations, these notes were an accounting ledger for him, and the ledger had not been closed. Custer, meanwhile, advanced. The Washita took its place in his career as a victory. In the years that followed, he referenced this victory. In the Plains campaigns, in the winter, with raid tactics. He believed this formula worked because it had worked at the Washita, at least according to his reports. But there was a lesson he had not learned at the Washita. Underestimating enemy strength might work once. It might seem to work twice, but it does not work every time. And at the foundation of underestimating enemy strength lies another underestimation. Underestimating the lives of one's own men. These two underestimations feed each other. One who does the first, over time, does the other as well. In the summer of 1876, Custer arrived at the Little Bighorn. On the open plains of Montana, the Lakota and Cheyenne forces gathered under the leadership of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were far beyond Custer's estimation. Scouting reports indicated a massive camp. Experienced officers suggested caution. Custer did not listen to these suggestions. He went on the attack. Benteen was there that day as well. Custer divided the unit into three. He gave Benteen an independent assignment. He ordered Major Marcus Reno to attack from across the river. He himself marched directly upon the main camp. Reno was forced to retreat. Benteen provided support to Reno. Custer's column, meanwhile, was closed in on from the north. This time the bugle calls were fading away toward Custer. Benteen debated whether or not he should send support to Custer that day. This debate still continues among historians. Some blame Benteen. Had he sent a rescue unit, Custer might have survived. Some defend Benteen. A rescue attempt would have annihilated Benteen's men as well. But within this debate lies a quiet irony. In 1868, Benteen had wanted a commander to take aid to his men trapped in the South. This request had been denied. In 1876, Benteen personally had to make the decision to take aid to men trapped in the South, and he made this decision in the shadow of the Washita. Custer did not survive at the Little Bighorn. He died along with 268 of his men. This number was 14 times that of the 19 men abandoned at the Washita. Arithmetic stands as an irony of history. Official history presents the Little Bighorn as a tragedy, a heroic end, a commander defeated but fighting. This narrative settled in quickly. Custer's death covered his mistakes, because the dead cannot make a defense. But the dead cannot be accused either, and this ambiguity wove itself into the myth. The Washita, on the other hand, had a different fate. For decades, the Washita remained a victory in official historiography. Elliot and his men were squeezed into footnotes. As academic studies took up this event, they interpreted Custer's decision in different ways. Some defended it, military necessity. Some condemned it, intentional abandonment. This debate never reached a sharp conclusion, because Custer was dead, and a dead man cannot explain whether he acted intentionally or not. But the documents were alive. Benteen's letters were alive. Godfrey's memoirs were alive. Lippincott's forensic report was alive. And these documents, when read together, pointed to a single conclusion. That morning, a man standing 2 miles away heard his men dying and remained motionless. Whatever the name of this inaction was, its outcome did not change. 19 men lay on the snow for weeks, stripped of their identities, peeled of their uniforms, their skulls crushed with rocks. When the scouting party found them, this was the only thing left on the field, the physical remnant of a betrayal. In American military history, what is called a command error is mostly a technical term: wrong position, faulty reconnaissance, insufficient ammunition. These are errors that can be corrected on paper. But some errors are not technical. Some errors are the decision at the moment one man chooses to ignore another man. The technical name for that decision is a failure of command. It has another name as well, and that name already stood there, on the frozen bank of the Washita River, in that silent area where 19 men lay beneath the snow, needing no mouth to speak it.
The snow melts, but the truth remains. The Washita River stories end here. Subscriptions and likes support Last Stand Stories. The next story chapters begins soon.